I'm Deborah Power. I'm based in the Centre de Ciências do Mar, so that's CCMAR, the Universidade do Algarve, which is in Faro, Portugal. And within the project, I am responsible for the work package 2, so I'm leading that, which is the juvenile quality work package. To answer that, you have to backtrack a little bit just to understand what was the basis and what underpins the work package 2. So effectively here, what we're thinking about in 2016, 2015 is the question of sustainability. And of course, work package 2 is focused on the hatchery stage. So the hatchery stage is in essence at the bottom of the pyramid. It's a very important foundation because it's from here we provide the juveniles. So there was an understanding that to improve sustainability, we needed to improve the management or to know more about that so that we were able to intervene and provide alternative solutions, since we're confronted with a number of challenges across the sector. And so we highlighted key performance indicators, which were going to serve as our benchmark. And then the work was directed at actually trying to respond to these key performance indicators. And so we're looking at growth, mortality, malformations, and so on. So the project was conceived around this. There are, of course, many projects. The industry has been initiated since the early 90s. And although we've had many projects, they're largely been projects that are based around laboratory and small-scale production. And this is where the PerformFISH is makes a very big step, because, of course, at the level of a hatchery, when you're talking about a massive recirculating system, or a massive production of eggs and larvae, this is very different from a few small tanks in a room. And therefore, this is where work package 2 came in. We wanted to do real time and real life situation and really go into the hatcheries and work with the hatcheries, the managers, and the other people that are required in the hatchery to try and develop methods and approaches that would allow us to have a management tool that we could then implement and use to assist the hatchery managers and help them guide their production. And therefore, what we did was to effectively work across several hatcheries in different countries within Europe, so that we could look for a uniform, if possible, solution or understand what the solutions could be and if the problems were the same or different. And then, in fact, go on the basis of trying to decipher what's the difference between good and bad quality production cycle. And so this allowed developments with regards to skeletal malformations. Professor Yorgos Komandouros, who is an expert in skeletal morphology, was working in the project, and so demonstrated in terms of the production parameters, the zootechnical parameters, how they link in potentially to the performance. Through this integration of large data sets, it was possible, therefore, to generate a program in a way that would allow us to try and associate particular malformations with particular zootechnical regimes. Through this approach also, he demonstrated that effectively there can be recovery of malformations during the grow-on phase. So this is quite important. And then on the other side, we were looking at egg quality, primarily myself, trying to link this to subsequent stage performance. And then a very large group of us were working together to develop potential predictive markers that might or not be linked to traits, but that are certainly correlated or associated with the quality, so that we would generate this management tool, which would allow managers to take decisions that would be informed as to whether or not they should continue or whether or not they should stock with the eggs or continue with a given larval production cycle. So it's been very much about trying to develop means by which hatcheries can have a better control over what they're doing, and doing this by not looking at one individual hatchery, but looking at across hatcheries. So we're looking for transversal problems and transversal solutions. And then also, as I said, was this big step up in scale to really take it into the hatcheries and to really work with production. So there were many challenges because, of course, production at this level is very challenging. It's a very high cost and high risk element of the production cycle, but it's been very rewarding because I do feel that we made quite significant progress. It really does come down to a large element of scale. You know, some of the things that are coming from the project, because what we realize that across Europe, of course, we can have a range, we have different management systems within hatcheries. Each hatchery has their tricks or their way of doing things. We have different brood stock, and potentially we have different environmental conditions. But we're asking, you know, can we tell, or can we identify something which is fundamentally important, which is linked to the biology perhaps, that will allow us some insight. So it was absolutely fundamentally important that we work directly with hatcheries, with the hatchery managers, with the workers, but also, you know, with the executive management, in the sense to get their agreement and to get them engaged in that. So this entailed things like sampling, which sounds trivial, but is not. It's very important. If you're dealing with millions of larvae and you're sampling half a dozen, this may not be representative. So it allowed us to talk to them. It allowed us to throw the doors open. They let us in and they allowed us to look and talk and discuss. So we had this first level of engagement. We then co-created our sampling book, which is leading through to the e-atlas that I think we'll talk about subsequently. I think this interaction and engagement allowed them to see better what the role of the scientist is. So rather than just handing over some samples or getting some data from a scientific paper, what we were doing were directly interacting with them along this process. And so giving them feedback, and they would question us, why are we doing this? What's the point of this? And also doing cutting edge things, new developments that are occurring. Of course, these large sequencing kind projects, the microbiota, so new kinds of imaging. So this also allowed them to see that, you know, there has been a shift in the way we can do science, and that this can have a very big impact in the outcome. So co-creation and co-engagement, because they're the end users. So in the end, we can do what we want, and we might be very happy with our publications, but really the idea is we can generate something that can then be used in industry. So we're really thinking about the technology readiness level. And so this was a very interesting experience. It was a project that allowed us both to do really innovative science directed at specific problems that the hatcheries and the companies identify, but also to develop solutions that are absolutely anchored in the production. And so that was challenging, but it was very exciting. Because, as I said, the scale of production has got nothing to do with a small scale experiment within an experimental facility. Here we're talking about real life production, what they are doing on a day-to-day basis. And so working with them, it was important that they also bought into this and understood the importance of what they were doing, because everything that we do depends on what they're doing, because we get the samples from them. And if we need particular kinds of samples, it was important that they would acknowledge that's important, why it's important. And that meant there was a much more open communication, and that things flowed well. We got the samples we needed, the right stages, and so on and so on. So I think that I've been in many European projects previously, but this is one of the first which was driven by industry, and therefore this was a very important part. They had put confidence that this project was going to deliver for them, and so this was important, that there should be this interaction, and that it really should be grounded in a standard production setting, and that therefore what we were working on is representative of what they are doing, and hopefully in that way is more realistic when we're proposing outcomes based on the analysis. Although we're now in the era of open access and open data and so on, the reality is, there's an awful lot of data sitting in drawers because things like photographs or things that they may not have looked so good, they might not be the perfect one. So this project, because it was like looking into the engine, we're really looking at the nuts and bolts because we're at the bottom of this production scale. What we wanted to do was see if we could really use this massive data collection and transform this into something that actually could be used. So rather than us do all this analysis and collect all this data and make the synthesis and make the final conclusions or proposals or suggestions, we wanted to try and see, since this covers a range of types of methodology from molecular through to morphological through to histology. So we really wanted to see if we could give a legacy. In other words, all of these samples that we received from the companies, we could in some way feed back, but in the format, for example, of an e-atlas. And that this would help them because we would try, therefore, to synthesize in the case of malformations. What were the malformations? What do they look like? How do we look at them? And how they could be looked at by a trained veterinary scientist or a trained professional in the hatchery on at least a first glance basis that could then be communicated to either a service provider that could then look in more detail. So this was there was a whole series of work done by the Mark Gagliotti and Paul Bernardi, which was specifically histopathology. So they were looking, at thousands of larvae, quite literally, but from a histological perspective. So they were looking inside, they were looking at the liver, they were looking at the appearances, it was abnormal. So this is, if you think about diagnostics, normally if a human were to go and be quiet. If you go to for an analysis, then there are standards parameters that are prepared. So your doctor or your technical assistant will be looking at that, and there are guidelines. But this actually is something you don't find often in agriculture. So we wanted to try and remedy that, since we have so many resources, many of which there is nowhere to put. You don't have a location really to open access or for the bad photographs or for the thousands of photographs. So we wanted to try and also leave something that comes from this investment, both of money from the EU, from many people, from PhDs, try and take from that and leave a document which is comprehensive and that is covering how to sample. And this will contribute to science as well, not just to the production setting, but also provide standardized operating procedures, the ones that we followed for the sampling, the handling of the samples, the shipping of the samples, reception of the samples, the processing of the samples, and then the analysis of the samples. And so this is what is reflected in the e-atlas, which is still an ongoing task because this is a fairly large process. But we hope that this document then can live on and be useful for the companies, industry, and also for scientists, because it is basically a documentation of many different observations that are coming from PerformFISH. At the hatchery level, this is focused again, as I say, on the hatchery.